how did a small kingdom on the edge of Europe rise to rule the seas and forge the world's first global empire? This immersive storytelling will guide you through 6 centuries of discovery, glory, and decline. Sit back, let yourself be carried away by this epic journey, and welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1: Origins and the Beginnings of Discoveries. Part 1: Medieval Portugal, the birth of a kingdom turned toward the ocean. At the turn of the Middle Ages, Portugal was still but a small kingdom, wedged at the far west of the Iberian Peninsula. Its territory, bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on one side and Castile on the other, seemed modest, almost insignificant, compared to the continental European powers. And yet, it was from this coastal fringe that one of the vastest maritime empires in history would emerge. Understanding the origins of medieval Portugal means delving into a context of struggles, alliances, and survival, where the sea became much more than a border. It became a promise of the future. The story begins with the Reconquista. Since the 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula had been divided between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim powers in the south. Wars, raids, and local crusades shaped political life. In the 11th century, the Counts of Portugal, a region centered around Porto, gained prominence. They aligned themselves with the kings of Leon and Castile, but gradually sought autonomy. This ambition reached its peak with Afonso Henriques, a founding figure who, after leading numerous campaigns, proclaimed himself King of Portugal in 1139. From then on, Portugal existed as an independent entity, recognized by the Pope in 1179. But it remained fragile, caught between more powerful neighbors. It had to forge its own identity. This is where geography played a decisive role. To the west, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, infinite, mysterious, carrying dangers, but also riches. The Portuguese, accustomed to fishing, coastal navigation, and maritime trade, developed an instinctive familiarity with the sea. In a narrow kingdom where agricultural lands were limited, salvation could only come from the outside, and that outside was the ocean. By the 13th century, Portugal had consolidated its borders. Unlike Castile and Aragon, it was not focused on Mediterranean expansion or peninsular unity. It looked elsewhere. Lisbon, recaptured from the Moors in 1147 with the help of crusaders from northern Europe, gradually became a cosmopolitan port. Genoese, Flemish, and English sailors could be found there. Ships traveled up and down the Atlantic coast carrying salt, wine, oil, but also ideas, stories, and navigational techniques. In this melting pot, the foundations of a unique maritime culture were formed. Portuguese monarchs quickly understood the value of supporting these exchanges. The salt trade, extracted from salt marshes, enriched the ports. The wine of the Douro, already renowned, traveled to northern Europe. Commercial alliances were forged, notably with England. In 1373, a treaty between the two kingdoms inaugurated a centuries-old friendship, the oldest diplomatic alliance still in force in the world. This opening to the Atlantic was not merely economic, it was also political and cultural. Portugal chose the sea as its horizon. The 14th century, however, brought its share of crises. Like elsewhere in Europe, the Black Death struck the population hard. Wars of succession shook the monarchy, leading to the crisis of 1383 or 1385. This was a decisive moment. The Aviz dynasty emerged victorious after the Battle of Aljubarrota, where the Portuguese repelled the Castilians. At their head, the Constable Nuno Alvares Pereira embodied national heroism. This victory guaranteed Portugal's independence and established a new dynasty on the throne. But above all, it marked an ideological turning point. The kingdom, having defended its freedom through arms, now sought to assert itself through expansion. Under the Aviz dynasty, one figure stood out in particular, the Infante Henry, better known as Henry the Navigator. Though not a great sailor himself, he embodied the vision of a Portugal turned toward the ocean. Settled in Sagres, at the southernmost tip of the country, he gathered around him cartographers, sailors, and engineers. He encouraged the construction of caravels, light and maneuverable ships capable of sailing against the wind. It was thanks to this innovation that the Portuguese would move beyond coastal navigation and venture further into the Atlantic. This maritime shift was not merely the result of disinterested curiosity. Portugal sought resources. Gold, which crossed the Sahara to North Africa, sparked ambitions. Spices from the east promised immense profits if a direct route could be found. Added to this was the desire to continue the crusade against Islam by bypassing Muslim territories to strike elsewhere. The expedition against Ceuta in 1415 was the first milestone of this expansion. But already in the 14th century, the spirit of discovery was sown in Portuguese ports. In coastal villages, fishermen ventured ever farther toward the Canaries, toward Madeira. They brought back not only fish, but also stories, tales of mysterious islands, strange currents, and stars guiding the way fueled the collective imagination. It was said that sailors had glimpsed lands to the west, beyond the horizon. These rumors prepared minds to believe that the ocean was not just a barrier, but a gateway to an unknown world. Thus, medieval Portugal, a small kingdom on the margins of major continental conflicts, forged a unique identity. It lacked the military might of great powers, but possessed a singular openness to the Atlantic. Its survival and prosperity depended on the sea it learned to master. It was no coincidence that a few generations later, Lisbon would become the capital of a global empire. Portugal's destiny was not preordained. It resulted from a blend of geographical necessity, political choices, and human audacity. The ocean, threatening and mysterious, became an ally. Portuguese sailors, heirs to centuries of fishing and trade, were unknowingly preparing to change the world. The kings, aware of the kingdom's fragility, encouraged this openness. And the people, in search of survival and glory, looked to the horizon. In the silence of the ports, amid the sound of waves and sails flapping in the wind, the story of the Portuguese Empire began. An empire that, starting from a tiny territory on the edge of Europe, would soon span multiple continents and leave a lasting mark on the planet. Part 2. Henry the Navigator and the School of Sagres, the impetus for exploration. At the dawn of the 15th century, Portugal stood at a decisive crossroads. The small kingdom, firmly anchored on the Atlantic coast, had survived Castilian threats and established a new dynasty, the Aviz, after the victory at Aljubarrota in 1385. Under the leadership of King John I and his heirs, it now sought to secure a future for this narrow territory, whose agricultural resources were insufficient to sustain long-term growth. It was in this context that a singular prince emerged, the Infante Dom Enrique, better known as Henry the Navigator. Henry was the third son of King John the Burrell and Philippa of Lancaster, an English princess. This blend of Portuguese and English blood already symbolized the dynasty's international openness. Born in 1394, Henry grew up in an atmosphere where the sea, chivalry, and Christian faith were closely intertwined. At a young age, he took part in the expedition that marked a true turning point in Portuguese history, the conquest of Ceuta in 1415. Ceuta, a major Muslim city located opposite Gibraltar, was then a hub of Mediterranean and Saharan trade. By capturing this city, the Portuguese hoped to disrupt the activities of Barbary pirates while controlling the flow of gold and slaves from Africa. The conquest was brutal, but it opened new perspectives. For Henry, still an adolescent, this victory revealed a new horizon, a world that extended far beyond the borders of the Iberian Peninsula. Upon returning to Portugal, Henry did not content himself with his title as governor of the Order of Christ, the spiritual heir of the Templars in the kingdom. He settled in the Algarve, in Sagres, at the southwestern tip of Europe. It was a symbolic location, an arid land, battered by winds, facing the unknown of the Atlantic. There, according to tradition, he gathered around him cartographers, astronomers, pilots, and shipwrights. This is referred to as the School of Sagres, though historians still debate the formal existence of such an institution. What is certain is that, under his impetus, Portugal acquired a veritable maritime laboratory. The caravel, the iconic ship of Portuguese discoveries, was born in this context. Light, equipped with triangular, lateen sails, it could sail against the wind, maneuver with agility, and cover long distances. At a time when heavy northern European ships struggled to navigate open waters, the caravel represented a revolution. Combined with advancements in cartography and astronomical navigation, it became the quintessential tool of Portuguese expansion. Henry the Navigator was not a sailor himself. He did not lead expeditions, but he played the role of patron, strategist, and visionary. He financed voyages, recruited men, and encouraged the exploration of African coasts. For him, three motivations intertwined: the pursuit of wealth, the spread of the Christian faith, and the prestige of the kingdom. Chronicles report that he dreamed of finding the mythical kingdom of Prester John, a supposed Christian realm in Africa or the East that would support the crusade against Islam. Under his patronage, Portuguese sailors achieved decisive milestones. In 1419, the island of Madeira was rediscovered and colonized. The Azores followed a few years later. These islands, located in the middle of the Atlantic, became strategic bases. Sugarcane was planted there, a crop that would yield immense profits and serve as a model for future colonial exploitation. But above all, They provided valuable experience in open sea navigation, allowing the Portuguese to understand the winds and currents governing the Atlantic. In the following decades, Portuguese captains progressed along the African coasts. They passed Cape Bojador, long considered an impassable limit, a wall of water and storms beyond which it was believed lay a world of sea monsters and darkness. In 1434, Gil Eanes broke this symbolic barrier. This success, encouraged by Henry, had immense repercussions. Nothing seemed impossible anymore. The Portuguese knew they could overcome the fears inherited from antiquity and venture into the unknown. From then on, exploration accelerated. Navigators discovered Cape Verde, skirted the shores of Senegal, and ventured further south. They brought back gold, slaves, new plant and animal species. Lisbon began to grow rich from this nascent trade, though on the scale of the kingdom, these profits remained modest. More important than gold was the accumulated experience. Each expedition improved the understanding of maritime routes, refined maps, and honed navigational techniques. Henry the Navigator died in 1460. He did not live to see the culmination of the projects he had initiated, but his role remains essential. In half a century, he gave Portugal a clear direction, the sea as a path to expansion. He fostered a generation of sailors ready to face the unknown, equipped with technical tools and fierce determination. He also tied the kingdom's fate to the conquest of distant lands, the pursuit of spices, gold, and souls to convert. His legacy is twofold. On one hand, he embodies the heroic vision of an enlightened prince who, from his fortress in Sagres, conceived the conquest of the world. On the other, he also symbolizes the early stages of a process that would upheaval entire continents. The slave trade, colonization, and the brutal clash of civilizations. The expeditions he encouraged were both sources of scientific progress and preludes to immense human tragedies. Be that as it may, at the time of his death, Henry's work was irreversible. Portugal was no longer a mere Iberian kingdom. It was a maritime power in the making, looking beyond its shores. In the decades that followed, its sailors would cross new capes, reach India, Brazil, China, and build the first truly global empire in history. Thus, Henry the Navigator, a prince of the shadows and a visionary of the open sea, remains the founding figure of this epic. Sagres, battered by winds and waves, stands as the symbol of the moment when a small kingdom chose to defy the ocean to inscribe its name in universal history. Part 3. The First Expeditions to Africa. Ceuta, Madeira, Azores. The year 1415 marked a rupture in the history of Portugal and, more broadly, in that of Europe. That year, a Portuguese armada crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and seized the city of Ceuta on the northern coast of Africa. This expedition, led by King John I and his sons, including Henry the Navigator, inaugurated the era of Portuguese conquests. Ceuta was not merely a fortress, it was a symbol and a springboard. Its capture opened a new dimension for Portugal, that of expansion beyond the seas. Ceuta was then a prosperous Muslim city, a crossroads of caravan routes from the Sahara. Gold from Sudan, slaves, ivory, and spices passed through it before reaching the Mediterranean. For the Portuguese, its occupation meant not only a strategic gain, but also a way to assert their religious fervor by continuing the crusade against Islam. Yet, despite the brilliance of the victory, Ceuta did not deliver the expected riches. Soon, the Portuguese realized that African caravans were bypassing the city, depriving the garrison of its commercial role. Far from discouraging the explorers, this realization pushed them to go further. If Ceuta was not enough, they needed to reach the sources of this trade, directly accessing the regions from which gold and slaves originated. This is where the strategic genius of Henry the Navigator came into play, not to limit themselves to a single conquest, but to open the way for systematic exploration of the African coasts. In the years that followed, Portuguese sailors ventured further south. But before circumnavigating Africa, they began by establishing themselves on the Atlantic islands. In 1419, João Gonçalves Zarco and Tristão Vaz Teixeira discovered Madeira, a volcanic island covered in forests. Shortly after, Bartolomeu Perestrello explored Porto Santo, a smaller neighboring island. These uninhabited territories offered Portugal a colonial laboratory. Lands were cleared, vines, wheat, and above all, sugarcane were planted. This last crop, cultivated with slave labor, would become the key to the colonial economy. Madeira thus became the prototype for future plantation colonies, where agricultural innovation, international trade, and human exploitation intertwined. A few years later, between 1427 and 1432, Portuguese navigators discovered the Azores archipelago, lost in the middle of the Atlantic. These fertile islands became a strategic stronghold. They served as a stopover for ships, a site for agricultural experimentation, and soon a base for settlement. Colonists brought livestock, plants, and expertise. The Azores established themselves as a bridge to the west, preparing minds for the idea that the ocean was not an impassable barrier, but a space to conquer. The colonization of these islands revealed several characteristics of future Portuguese expansion. First, the ability to adapt, transforming a virgin environment into a productive space. Second, the combination of commerce and religion. Each settlement was accompanied by the founding of churches, religious orders, and a social organization modeled on Portugal. Finally, the growing use of slavery. Already captives from Africa were introduced to Madeira to work in the sugarcane fields. This system, still limited, foreshadowed the tragic dimensions it would take later in Brazil and the Caribbean. Meanwhile, explorers continued to advance along the African coasts. The crossing of Cape Boiador in 1434 by Gil Innes represented a decisive step. For a long time, sailors had feared this point, surrounded by legends. It was said that the waters beyond were boiling, populated by sea monsters, or that ships could not return due to contrary winds. When Innes returned safely, bringing reliable accounts, these fears dissipated. The world opened up. From that moment, the Portuguese established trading posts along the African coasts. Fortified posts allowed them to trade with local populations. They bought gold, ostrich feathers, gum arabic, but above all, slaves. In 1444, a fleet brought back nearly 235 African captives to Lagos, in southern Portugal. This episode, described with pride in the chronicles of the time, marked the official start of the Atlantic slave trade organized by the Portuguese. These men, women, and children, reduced to slavery, would be employed in Madeira's sugarcane fields or resold in Europe. The economic impact of these early expeditions remained limited in the 15th century, but their symbolic significance was immense. Portugal established itself as a pioneering power, ready to defy the ocean and create new routes. In Lisbon, exotic goods began to appear: carved ivory, strange animals, colorful fabrics. These riches, though modest, fueled the imagination and enhanced the crown's prestige. Atlantic exploration was not limited to the African coast. Portuguese sailors ventured further west, testing currents and observing the stars. The Azores became an astronomical laboratory. Maps were refined, navigational instruments like the astrolabe and compass were improved. Gradually, Portugal forged an unrivaled technical mastery in Europe. Yet these expeditions were not without difficulties. Shipwrecks were frequent, diseases decimated crews, and relations with African peoples oscillated between trade and conflict. But each failure was analyzed, each success recorded. At court, chroniclers like Gomes Anis de Zurara recounted these voyages, magnifying the image of the king and the navigators. Expansion became a national cause, almost a divine mission. By the mid-15th century, Portugal had thus laid the foundations of its empire. It controlled Ceuta, colonized Madeira and the Azores, and began establishing trading posts on the African coast. Above all, it had overcome the fear of the ocean and transformed the sea into a space of action. This momentum would not stop. The following generations would push further, reaching the Cape of Good Hope, India, and crossing the Atlantic to America. These early expeditions were like the first stones of a cathedral. Modest in appearance, they laid the groundwork for a colossal architecture. Portugal, a small kingdom on the margins of Europe, was preparing to become the center of a globalized world. The epic had begun, and universal history was about to change course. Chapter 2: The Golden Age of the Great Discoveries. Part 1: Vasco da Gama and the Route to the Indies. By the late 15th century, Portugal was already a transformed kingdom. From a modest Iberian power, it had become a nation of daring navigators, accumulating experience, maps, and strategic strongholds along the Atlantic and African coasts. But one dream continued to haunt Lisbon: finding a direct route to the Indies, that fabled land from which spices, gold, and precious stones originated. The Portuguese knew that spices reached Europe through the Middle East and the Mediterranean, dominated by Venetians and Ottomans. To break this monopoly, they needed to circumnavigate Africa and reach the Indian Ocean directly. This quest, both economic and political, would find its hero, Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama, born around 1469 in Sagres, was a modest nobleman, but endowed with the resolute spirit and maritime expertise inherited from decades of Portuguese experimentation. In 1497, under the reign of Manuel I, he received the most audacious mission of his time: to pass the Cape of Good Hope, continue beyond, and find the route to the Indies. This expedition was not a whim. It was the result of Portugal's strategic vision. The kingdom, thanks to its navigators, already mastered the winds and currents of the Atlantic. Its caravels and naos were technical marvels, capable of withstanding months of navigation. Lisbon had precise maps, seasoned pilots, and solid bases in Madeira, the Azores, Cape Verde, and along the African coast. All this formed a network that made possible what a few decades earlier seemed unthinkable. On July 8, 1497, Vasco da Gama left Lisbon with 4 ships and about 170 men. The journey was long, fraught with storms, diseases, and privations. The crews had to face scurvy, a terrible affliction that ravaged bodies, deprived of fresh fruits and vegetables. But discipline, faith, and the resolve to accomplish a divine mission kept the fleet moving forward. After passing the Cape of Good Hope, already reached by Bartolomeo Diaz in 1488, da Gama ventured into seas still unknown to Europeans. In May 1498, he finally reached Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. This achievement resounded as an unprecedented victory. For the first time, a European had connected Europe to Asia by sea, bypassing all intermediaries. This voyage changed the global landscape. Portugal, a small kingdom of barely 1 million inhabitants, suddenly became the first maritime power capable of controlling the spice route. The grandeur of this accomplishment lay not only in the nautical feat, it also resided in the economic and political vision that accompanied it. By reaching India directly, Portugal disrupted the global commercial balance. Until then, spices arrived in Europe through complex networks of Arab, Indian, Ottoman, and Venetian merchants. Their prices soared with each intermediary. Now Lisbon could import them at the source, sell them at reduced prices, and still reap colossal profits. This strategy transformed the Portuguese capital into a nerve center of global trade, but this route was not merely an economic affair. It embodied Portugal's strategic power. The nascent empire rested on a simple but effective principle: control key access points, impose a military and diplomatic presence, and build a global network. Vasco da Gama, returning to Portugal in 1499, was celebrated as a hero. His mission proved that the dream of Dom Henrique, Henry the Navigator, had become reality. The ocean was tamed, and the Indies were no longer a distant myth, but an accessible reality. Behind this epic lay decisive political choices. King Manuel I understood that Portugal's greatness rested on the sea. He invested in fleets, the training of pilots, and the construction of modern arsenals. Lisbon became a bustling port, where merchants, artisans, and foreigners were drawn by promises of wealth. The kingdom, once peripheral, now placed itself at the center of the world. The route to the Indies was not just a journey, it founded an empire. From the early 16th century, the Portuguese established fortified trading posts in India, notably in Goa, which became the capital of their Eastern Empire. They imposed their naval power in the Indian Ocean, confronted Arab and Ottoman fleets, and established themselves as arbiters of trade between East and West. The effect of grandeur was also evident in how contemporaries perceived these exploits. In the eyes of Europeans, Portugal was now a chosen nation, guided by Providence. Chroniclers described Vasco da Gama as a new Alexander, a conqueror of the seas. The Portuguese Empire was built not only through arms and ships, but also through an aura of prestige, faith, and divine legitimacy. Economically, the consequences were spectacular. Cargoes of spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, brought immense profits. In a few years, the revenues from Eastern trade surpassed all other resources of the kingdom. This wealth financed not only the court, but also new expeditions. Each success led to another in an irresistible dynamic of expansion. Yet, this success came at a cost. The Portuguese had to resort to violence to impose their domination. They bombarded recalcitrant ports, imposed unequal treaties, and demanded tributes. Their empire was not only commercial, it was military, structured by a strategy of controlling the seas. The Carrera de India, the regular route between Lisbon and Goa, became the vital artery of a global empire. By reaching the Indies, Vasco da Gama and his successors gave Portugal unprecedented supremacy. In a world where other European powers were only beginning to venture onto the seas, Lisbon held a considerable lead. This advantage rested on three pillars: technical mastery, strategic vision, and the ability to mobilize limited resources effectively. In 1502, during his second voyage, Vasco da Gama returned with a larger fleet and imposed Portuguese authority in Calicut by force. The message was clear. The Portuguese Empire was not content with opening routes. It intended to dominate them. This determination, allied with rigorous organization, explains why such a small kingdom could create such a vast empire. Vasco da Gama's voyage thus symbolized Portugal's entry into its golden age. It was the founding act of a maritime and commercial power that, for several decades, would be unequaled. Through this exploit, Lisbon established itself as the capital of a now connected world, a world where the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a frontier, but a planetary highway. Part 2. Magellan and the First Circumnavigation of the Globe. When Vasco da Gama opened the route to the Indies in 1498, Portugal rose to the rank of the world's foremost maritime power. Lisbon became a bustling port where merchants, diplomats, and adventurers from across Europe converged. But already, Portuguese ambitions extended beyond the spice route alone. The kingdom aimed to be the master of the seas, the builder of a planetary empire. In this context emerged the figure of Fernão de Magalhães, better known as Magellan, who, though rejected by his king, remains one of the most brilliant symbols of Portuguese audacity. Magellan was born around 1480 into a noble family in northern Portugal. Early on, he trained in the art of navigation and participated in Portuguese expeditions to India and Africa. He knew the maritime routes, commercial alliances, and the limits of the Portuguese system. When he proposed to the crown to explore a new route to the Indies by heading west, he met with refusal. Portugal, confident in its dominance of the Indian Ocean, did not wish to risk its resources on an uncertain venture. Disappointed, Magellan turned to Spain, Portugal's rival. Magellan's choice illustrates the strength and confidence Portugal had acquired by the early 16th century. The kingdom, rich with its African, Indian, and Asian trading posts, could afford to reject projects deemed too adventurous. This assurance was itself the fruit of a well-thought-out strategy. controlling straits, securing routes, and building a fortified network of maritime bases. But it also showed a limitation. Sometimes, excessive confidence closed doors. Spain, frustrated by the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, which divided the world between Spaniards and Portuguese, giving the eastern Atlantic to the latter, was desperate to find a way to compete. It saw in Magellan the providential man. Thus, although his expedition sailed under the Spanish flag, it remains inseparable from the Portuguese legacy. For without the knowledge, maps, and experience accumulated by Lisbon, such a project would never have been conceivable. In 1519, Magellan left Seville with 5 ships and about 250 men. His mission was clear: to reach the Moluccas, the spice-rich islands of Indonesia, by sailing west. This voyage was a gamble, a folly in the eyes of many. But behind the adventure lay a strategic logic. If Spain could access the Moluccas by a different route, it could break the Portuguese monopoly. The crossing was a succession of titanic trials. Magellan laboriously explored the southern coast of America, searching for a passage to the unknown ocean beyond. After months of suffering and mutinies, he finally discovered the strait that would bear his name, the Strait of Magellan. This winding and dangerous passage opened onto an ocean of unsuspected vastness. Magellan named it the Pacific, deceived by its apparent calm. In reality, it would be the expedition's most terrible ordeal. For 3 months, the ships drifted in the Pacific, facing hunger, thirst, and scurvy. Dozens of sailors perished, but the expedition pressed on, driven by the idea of grandeur, by the conviction that the world could be conquered by sea. Finally, in 1521, it reached the Philippines, then the Moluccas. Magellan himself died in a battle against natives in Mactan. Yet, his expedition did not stop. Under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, a single ship, the Victoria, continued the journey and, in 1522, completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. This monumental achievement transcended the mere rivalry between Portugal and Spain. It demonstrated conclusively that the earth was round, that the oceans were interconnected, and that the world was now unified by the sea. And behind this exploit, the Portuguese imprint was omnipresent. The techniques, navigational instruments, and knowledge of winds and currents were the fruit of a century of Portuguese exploration. For Portugal, this voyage was an indirect victory. True, Spain reaped the immediate glory, but in reality, Magellan was a product of the Portuguese system. His expedition proved that Portuguese methods and vision were universal, capable of embracing the entire globe. Portugal, through its maritime strategy, had paved the way for a globalization that would not stop. Economically and geopolitically, this era marked the apogee of Portuguese power. Spice cargoes flooded Lisbon. Pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg became treasures that enriched the crown. The trade in African gold, Madeiran sugar, and soon Brazilian sugar completed this prosperity. Portugal, a small peripheral kingdom, transformed into a global hub. Its ships plied all known oceans. Its merchants established trading posts from Angola to Japan, from Goa to Bahia. The grandeur of this success rested on precise, strategic choices. Unlike the Spaniards, who prioritized the conquest of vast continental territories in America, the Portuguese bet on the sea. They did not massively occupy lands, but controlled routes, ports, and straits. Their empire was an empire of flows, circulation, and maritime domination. It was a spider's web where each thread was a trading post, a fortress, a port, and Lisbon pulled the strings. This system offered several advantages. First, it was suited to the kingdom's size. With few men, Portugal could control vast spaces by occupying strategic points. Second, it allowed extraordinary mobility. Portuguese fleets could move quickly, adapt to threats, and seize opportunities. Finally, it concentrated wealth on rare and precious products, like spices, ensuring disproportionate profits relative to investments. This strategy transformed Lisbon into a world capital. Italian, Flemish, and German merchants flocked to buy Portuguese spices. The Portuguese language became a lingua franca of maritime trade. The kingdom's prestige grew to the point of impressing Europe's great courts. Even popes praised the Portuguese as champions of faith and Christian expansion. Magellan's expedition, though Spanish, thus illustrated the power of the Portuguese vision. It demonstrated that the ocean was no longer a barrier, but a link connecting continents. It embodied the idea of grandeur that Portugal, first among nations, had brought to life, transforming the sea into an empire, the unknown into territory, the horizon into wealth. Thus, at the dawn of the 16th century, the Portuguese Empire reached a truly planetary dimension. Its ships dominated the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and now participated in the discovery of the Pacific. Never had such a small kingdom achieved such power. Never had a nation dared to embrace the entire globe. And all this was thanks to a clear strategy, a dynamic economy, and an unrelenting vision, making the ocean the key to greatness. Part 3, Goa, Malacca, and Macao, the construction of an empire in Asia. At the dawn of the 16th century, after Vasco da Gama's exploit and the consolidation of the route to the Indies, Portugal entered a decisive phase of its expansion. The kingdom was no longer merely a bold explorer. It became a builder of empire. To transform its discoveries into lasting power, it needed to control strategic points in the Indian Ocean and the Far East. This is where three places that would leave a lasting mark on history come into play: Goa, Malacca, and Macao. Each represents an essential step in the Portuguese strategy, and together they formed the backbone of a global maritime empire. In 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque, one of the empire's greatest strategists, seized Goa on India's west coast. This city, already prosperous due to its trade, offered a natural port and a central position in the Indian Ocean. The choice of Goa was no accident. It reflected Portugal's vision of controlling routes rather than occupying vast territories. Goa quickly became the administrative and military capital of the Portuguese East. Under Portuguese rule, the city underwent a profound transformation. Majestic churches, palaces, and convents rose, making Goa a showcase of Catholic faith. But above all, it became a commercial crossroads where Indian, Arab, Persian, Chinese, and European merchants converged. The Portuguese organized a system of licenses, the cartas, requiring every ship to pay a fee to navigate. This strategy allowed Portugal to impose its authority not only on the ports it directly controlled, but also on the entire maritime trade of the region. Goa embodied Portuguese power at its peak, a cosmopolitan, flourishing city where cultures, religions, and economic interests mingled. It was the beating heart of an empire that, for the first time, directly linked Europe to Asia without intermediaries. If Goa ensured control of the western Indian Ocean, Malacca represented the key to Southeast Asia. Located in the eponymous strait between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. Malacca was a mandatory passage for all ships connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Whoever controlled Malacca controlled the spice trade, those precious goods that dictated the global economy of the 16th century. In 1511, Albuquerque launched a daring expedition and took Malacca after a fierce battle. The event resounded like a thunderclap in the Asian world. A foreign power, coming from beyond the seas, imposed its law on one of the continent's greatest trading hubs. From then on, Portugal held the lock on Eastern trade. The Portuguese strategy in Malacca was clear: transform the city into a fortress and a warehouse. Portuguese ships imposed taxes, controlled flows, and regulated trade. At the same time, they used Malacca as a starting point to push further east toward the Moluccas, the famous Spice Islands. This conquest was not only a military triumph, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. Portugal, with a handful of men and a few ships, became master of a strategic passage that would influence global trade for centuries. After India and Southeast Asia, the Portuguese sought to reach another giant, China. For centuries, the Middle Kingdom had fascinated Europe with its silks, porcelain, tea, and vast population. But China, powerful and wary, did not easily open its doors to foreigners. The Portuguese had to use patience, diplomacy, and strategy to find a place there. In 1557, they obtained permission to establish a colony in Macao on China's southern coast, near Canton. This was not a conquest by arms, but a diplomatic victory. The Chinese allowed the Portuguese to settle in exchange for commercial and maritime services. Macao thus became the bridge between China and Europe, a unique trading post that would allow Chinese products to flood European markets. Macao represented another facet of Portuguese strategy: flexibility. Unlike the conquests of Goa and Malacca, achieved through war, Macao was born of negotiation. This demonstrated Portugal's ability to adapt to circumstances, combining force and diplomacy to achieve its goals. These 3 points, Goa, Malacca, Macao, perfectly illustrate the Portuguese vision. Rather than spreading across vast territories, the Portuguese controlled routes, ports, and straits. Their empire was like a chain, each link connecting one ocean to another, each trading post serving as a stopover fortress and market. This strategy, remarkably effective, allowed Portugal to dominate a vast space with limited means. A few thousand men sufficed to hold strategic points that, through leverage, influenced the trade of millions of people. It was a maritime empire, mobile, founded on mastery of the sea and economic flows. The Portuguese economy then experienced a golden age. Spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg brought colossal profits. each ship returning from the Indies or Asia carried cargo whose value sometimes exceeded that of an entire European kingdom. Lisbon became the center of global trade where Venetian, German, Flemish, and English merchants flocked. African gold, Madeiran sugar, and soon Brazilian sugar completed this prosperity. Portugal, with barely 1.5 million inhabitants, managed to play a disproportionate role on the world stage. Its power rested not on demographics, but on strategy, technology, and vision. The kingdom became a global empire, linking Europe, Africa, Asia, and soon America, in an unprecedented network of trade and influence. In the eyes of contemporaries, Portugal was then an exceptional nation. Chronicles described Lisbon as the capital of spices, a city where the riches of the entire world converged. Portuguese kings presented themselves as champions of Christendom, carrying the faith to the ends of the earth. Missionaries accompanied merchants, churches rose in Goa and Macao, and religious orders spread European culture. This grandeur rested on clear choices, investing in the navy, encouraging explorers, and imposing a coherent strategy. Portugal demonstrated that a small kingdom through the sea could dominate vast spaces. This model would later inspire the Dutch and the English, but at that time, it was the Portuguese who led the way. Goa, Malacca, and Macao were not just conquests, they were symbols. They embodied the apogee of the Portuguese Empire, proof that with limited means, a nation could become global. They reminded us that power lies not only in brute force, but also in strategic vision, intelligence, and adaptability. Chapter 3. The Apogee and Colonial Rivalries. Part 1. Brazil, the new pearl of the Portuguese crown. At the turn of the 16th century, as Portugal asserted its dominance over the Indian Ocean and consolidated its positions in Asia, another discovery transformed its destiny. Brazil. This vast, lush territory came to the Portuguese almost by chance in 1500 when the fleet of Pedro Álvares Cabral, headed for the Indies, drifted westward and landed on the coasts of South America. The event, seemingly fortuitous, was nonetheless part of the logic of the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, which divided the New World between Spaniards and Portuguese along a meridian. Thanks to this arbitrary line, Portugal gained a colossal space that would quickly become the heart of its Atlantic empire. At first, Brazil did not seem to have the value of the Asian trading posts. Early explorers described a vast territory, covered in forests, inhabited by indigenous peoples, but lacking the coveted spices. Yet, it possessed an immediately exploitable resource, Brazil wood, a tree whose red sap was used for dyeing. Soon, ships began loading this precious wood for export to Europe. This trade, modest in appearance, gave the country its name and opened the way for more ambitious colonization. The true transformation of Brazil came with the introduction of sugarcane. From the 1530s, the Portuguese established the first sugar mills on the coast. The experience gained in Madeira and the Azores was transposed on a gigantic scale. The climate, fertile soils, and vastness of Brazilian lands offered ideal conditions for massive production. Sugar quickly became the white gold of the era, a luxury product in Europe. consumed by elites and sought after in every court. To develop this industry, Portugal established a structured colonial system. Lands were divided into captaincies, entrusted to donataries tasked with exploiting and defending them. European settlers, arriving in small numbers, settled along the coasts. But labor was lacking to cultivate sugarcane and operate the mills. The Portuguese first attempted to enslave indigenous populations, but these resisted, fled inland, or died in large numbers from imported diseases. Soon, another solution emerged: the importation of African slaves. This is where a tragic junction occurred between the two poles of the Portuguese Empire, Africa and Brazil. From the mid-16th century, Portuguese ships organized a regular slave trade from Angola and the Gulf of Guinea to the plantations of the New World. This triangular trade, Europe, Africa, America, became one of the pillars of the colonial economy. It enriched Lisbon, fueled the fortunes of Brazilian planters, and met European demand for sugar. But it also inaugurated one of the darkest pages in history, marked by the deportation and enslavement of millions of human beings. Despite this violence, Brazil quickly appeared as an unparalleled source of power. In the 16th century, it became the world's leading sugar-producing colony, surpassing the Spanish Antilles. Lisbon, already the capital of Asian spices, also became the center of the sugar trade. Portugal, tiny in population, now dominated two essential global markets. Brazil also offered another asset: its size. Unlike the Asian trading posts, limited to coastal enclaves, Brazilian territory stretched over thousands of kilometers. Even if the Portuguese did not immediately explore its full depth, they claimed sovereignty over it, laying the foundations for a unique territorial empire in America. This vastness gave Portugal a strategic depth that few other powers possessed. Brazilian colonial society was structured around this plantation system. European settlers, a minority, dominated the land and wealth. African slaves formed the majority of the workforce. Indigenous populations, marginalized, were pushed inland or forcibly integrated into religious missions. In this context, the church played a central role. Jesuit missionaries accompanied settlers, founded villages, and evangelized the indigenous people. Their actions, a mix of protection and coercion, helped shape the identity of colonial Brazil. Portugal also established a military and administrative organization to defend its colony. Attacks by French and Dutch corsairs necessitated the construction of fortresses and the maintenance of garrisons. But Brazil's main defense lay in its integration into the global Portuguese system. Lisbon jealously controlled trade, prohibiting colonists from trading freely with other nations. Everything had to pass through the metropolis, which centralized profits and financed its power through colonial revenues. Brazil thus became the pearl of the Portuguese crown, an economic jewel that, alongside Asian spices, placed the kingdom at the height of its power. In Lisbon, Brazilian riches funded the embellishment of the city, the rise of the arts, and the construction of sumptuous buildings. Portugal, thanks to this dual Atlantic and Asian empire, embodied the very model of global power. This success was not only material, it was also ideological and symbolic. Portugal saw itself as invested with a civilizing mission, convinced it was bringing Christian faith and European culture to the ends of the world. This religious legitimation often masked the brutal reality of colonization, but it strengthened the monarchy's prestige and justified expansion. In the eyes of Europe, Portugal appeared as a chosen nation, a pioneer of a globalization that was reshaping the world map. Yet this grandeur carried the seeds of fragility. Brazil, with its wealth and size, soon attracted the covetousness of other powers. The French attempted several times to establish themselves there. Later, the Dutch would launch prolonged expeditions. Portugal, despite its global network, remained a small kingdom, vulnerable to repeated attacks. But for now, in the 16th century, Brazil embodied the dazzling success of its empire. Thus, in a few decades, Portugal transformed a fortuitous discovery into a global economic center. It combined its African and Atlantic experiences to create a colonial system of formidable efficiency. Brazil, through its sugar production, natural resources, and territorial vastness, became the pillar of the Portuguese Empire. With it, Lisbon reigned over 2 oceans, dominated 2 continents, and imposed its model of maritime and commercial empire on the entire planet. Part 2. Dutch and English competition in Asia and Africa. At the dawn of the 17th century, Portugal dominated an empire stretching from South America to African coasts, from the Indian Ocean to the distant Pacific. Its ships plied the seas, its trading posts dotted the routes, and its cargoes of spices and sugar supplied all of Europe. Lisbon, a cosmopolitan capital, was the center of a new world. Yet, this supremacy was soon challenged. New maritime powers, the United Provinces, the future Netherlands, and England, emerged with formidable energy and ambition. These nations, driven by commerce and a fierce desire to dominate the seas, quickly shook Portugal's position. Portugal had built its empire on a simple yet brilliant principle: controlling strategic points, straits, ports, and maritime routes. With a handful of men and a disciplined fleet, it had managed to hold its own against vastly larger empires. But this strategy required constant vigilance and permanent naval superiority. By the turn of the 17th century, several factors weakened Portugal. The Aviz dynasty had died out in 1580, and the kingdom came under the Spanish crown, ushering in the Iberian Union. Far from strengthening Portugal's position, this attachment drew the ire of Spain's enemies. The Dutch and English, at war with the Spanish monarchy, directly targeted Portuguese possessions. The United Provinces, young and dynamic, had a powerful merchant fleet and an unparalleled entrepreneurial spirit. Their ships, financed by private companies, were fast, well-armed, and above all supported by abundant capital. In 1602, the Dutch founded the Dutch East India Company, the famous VOC, a commercial organization with quasi-state powers, raising armies, signing treaties, founding colonies. This institutional innovation gave the Dutch a decisive advantage, a capacity for action and investment superior to that of the Portuguese monarchy, whose resources remained limited. From the early decades of the 17th century, the Dutch launched a methodical offensive against the Portuguese Empire. In Asia, They seized the Moluccas, those mythical islands producing cloves and nutmeg, jewels of global trade. They contested Portuguese control over Ceylon, Malacca, and Java. They established their base at Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, which became the center of their Asian empire. Through perseverance and organization, they gradually eroded Portuguese positions, turning the Lusitanian monopoly into a commercial battlefield. The English, too, entered the scene with the creation of the English East India Company in 1600. Like their Dutch rivals, they used the chartered company model, mobilizing private capital and state support. Less aggressive than the Dutch at first, they gradually established themselves in India, competing with Goa and other Portuguese bases. Their naval power grew rapidly, supported by an England increasingly turning to the sea as an instrument of its greatness. Faced with these attacks, Portugal tried to resist. Its fortresses, built at strategic points, sometimes held firm thanks to their solidity and the discipline of their garrisons. Goa remained a Portuguese stronghold in India. Macao continued to be the privileged bridge to China, but in many cases, the combined pressure of the Dutch and English eventually prevailed. The financial, technological, and organizational superiority of these new powers proved formidable. In Africa, the situation was equally tense. The Dutch attacked Portuguese trading posts on the west coast, notably in Angola and the Congo, hoping to control the slave trade to the Americas. In Brazil, they even launched a partial occupation in the northeast, seizing Recife and the Pernambuco region in the 1630s. For nearly 20 years, Portugal had to wage a fierce war to reclaim its lands, mobilizing colonists, allied indigenous groups, and reinforcements from Europe. This resistance, ultimately victorious, demonstrated the resilience of the Portuguese Empire. But it also revealed its fragility, an extended empire, rich but vulnerable to repeated attacks. This clash between Portugal and its competitors marked a turning point in world history. In the 16th century, Lisbon had enjoyed a near-absolute monopoly, the fruit of its technical lead and audacity. In the 17th century, it had to contend with a multipolar system, where several European powers competed for the seas. The Dutch and English, equipped with modern fleets, powerful capital, and efficient institutions, embodied a new era of global commerce, based on capitalism and private organization. Yet Portugal retained many strengths. Its global network remained impressive. It continued to control vast territories in Brazil, strategic trading posts in Africa and Asia, and valuable maritime routes. Its knowledge of the oceans, accumulated experience, and flexible diplomacy allowed it to maintain a significant position despite losses. The kingdom, though weakened, was not erased from the map. Economically, competition reduced profit margins, but also stimulated adaptation. Lisbon sought to diversify its revenues, exploiting Brazil further, strengthening the sugar trade, and later, tobacco and coffee. Portugal also relied on its alliances, notably with England, to preserve some of its interests. This ability to rebound, to reinvent itself, testified to the vitality of an empire that, even under siege, continued to weigh on the world. The rivalry with the Dutch and English was thus not only a military and commercial episode, It marked the end of a monopoly and the beginning of a global competition where several European nations shared the ocean. Portugal, the pioneer of discoveries, saw its role evolve. From undisputed master, it became one of the actors in a more complex system. But its legacy endured. The routes it opened, the techniques it perfected, and the models it invented served as the foundation for its rivals. Even in losing ground, it remained at the heart of the game. Thus, in the 17th century, Portugal embodied both the grandeur of an empire that had dominated the world and the limits of a power with constrained resources, facing more numerous and wealthier competitors. Its struggle against the Dutch and English revealed the fragility of maritime empires, but it also showcased the incredible Portuguese legacy. Being the first to prove that the sea could unite the world and that a small kingdom could stand up to giants. Part 3. The Iberian Union, 1580 to 1640, and the fragility of the empire. At the end of the 16th century, Portugal, master of the oceans and pioneer of the great discoveries, faced a decisive turning point. In 1580, the Aviz dynasty died out with the death of King Henry I without a direct heir. The ensuing succession crisis plunged the kingdom into uncertainty. After intrigues, rival claimants, and internal tensions, it was ultimately Philip II of Spain, grandson of the Portuguese King Manuel I, who imposed his authority. Thus began the Iberian Union, a 60-year period during which Portugal was placed under the Spanish crown. At first glance, this union might seem a formidable opportunity. Two powerful kingdoms, united under a single dynasty, together held a gigantic empire spanning Europe, America, Africa, and Asia. Never before had a monarch ruled over such an ensemble. Yet, this union quickly revealed its limits and dangers for Portugal. For while the crowns were united, the empires remained distinct. Portugal retained its laws, institutions, and colonies, but in practice, its fate was tied to that of Spain, and thus to the incessant wars the Hispanic monarchy waged against France, England, and the United Provinces. The small kingdom, once independent and pragmatic in its alliances, found itself dragged into European conflicts that were not its own. This situation significantly weakened the Portuguese Empire. Its rivals, enemies of Spain, used the Iberian Union as a pretext to attack its possessions. Goa, Malacca, Ceylon, Brazil, and Angola became battlegrounds where the future of global trade was at stake. Portugal, caught in the trap, had to defend its positions with limited resources. At the same time, the Portuguese Empire suffered from a structural problem, its disproportionate extent relative to its means. The kingdom, with a modest population, struggled to provide the settlers, soldiers, and ships needed to maintain its conquests. Under Spanish domination, its interests were often neglected in favor of Castilian priorities centered on America. Lisbon gradually lost its centrality, its role as a world capital challenged by Seville and Madrid. Economically, the effects were ambivalent. On one hand, the Portuguese Empire continued to generate considerable wealth. Brazilian sugar, African gold, Asian spices. These products maintained the kingdom's prestige and supplied all of Europe. But on the other hand, these riches were partly diverted to Spain, consumed in its costly wars against major European powers. Portugal, instead of fully benefiting from its conquest, became a piece in a larger chessboard. The fragility was also evident in the rise of revolts and challenges. Brazilian colonists faced repeated Dutch attacks which occupied Recife and part of Pernambuco in the 1630s. In Asia, Portuguese trading posts were besieged, sometimes lost, under the combined pressure of the Dutch and English. Local populations, sometimes hostile, took advantage of Portuguese weakening to rebel. The empire, once invincible, showed its cracks. Yet, this period was not solely one of decline. It also testified to Portuguese resilience. Despite Spanish domination, Portuguese elites retained a strong identity and a desire for independence. Merchants, missionaries, and governors continued to administer the colonies with energy. Lisbon, even weakened, remained a major commercial hub where goods from the four corners of the world converged. The end of the Iberian Union in 1640 illustrated this vitality. Taking advantage of Spain's weakening, exhausted by the 30 Years' War and revolts in Catalonia, Portugal rose under the leadership of John of Braganza, proclaimed king as John IV. The restoration of independence, celebrated as a national renaissance, showed that the kingdom, despite 60 years of tutelage, had not lost its identity or ambition. But the legacy of the Iberian Union weighed heavily. Portugal emerged weakened, stripped of several Asian possessions and contested in Africa and Brazil. Its rivals had gained footholds on the routes it had opened, and its monopoly was definitively broken. The golden age of the 16th century gave way to a more uncertain era, where the kingdom had to fight to preserve its gains. This fragility did not erase the grandeur of the Portuguese enterprise, for even under foreign domination, its empire continued to function, generate wealth, and fascinate Europe. Portugal remained an indispensable player in global trade, a respected pioneer, sometimes envied, sometimes attacked, but never ignored. The Iberian Union thus revealed a paradox. It was both a period of vulnerability and proof of the solidity of the Portuguese Empire's foundations. For despite the losses, despite the attacks, despite temporary absorption by Spain, Portugal managed to rise again, recover, and continue its colonial adventure. Its empire, though weakened, remained one of the vastest and most influential in the world. Thus, between 1580 and 1640, Portugal lived a unique experience, that of seeing its crown merged with that of Europe's greatest monarchy, but also that of realizing the fragility of a global empire built on limited resources. This lesson profoundly marked its history. It served as a reminder that grandeur, even dazzling, rests on a fragile balance between ambition and means, and that the Portuguese Empire, to survive, had to constantly adapt, resist, and reinvent itself. Chapter 4. The Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. Part 1. The cycle of sugar, gold, and slaves in Brazil. In the 17th century, the beating heart of the Portuguese Empire was no longer in Asia, but in America. While Goa, Malacca, or Ceylon wavered under the blows of the Dutch and the English, Brazil became the central pillar of a transforming power. It was there, in the tropical vastness, that Portugal's future was at stake. And this destiny was built on three pillars: sugar, gold, and slaves. Three riches that brought new life to the kingdom, but at the cost of suffering, violence, and endless rivalries. Sugar, introduced as early as the 16th century, reached an unprecedented scale in the 17th century. Plantations along the Brazilian coast multiplied, transforming landscapes into vast fields lined with mills. The climate and fertile soils allowed for abundant harvests, and Europe, eager for this now indispensable commodity, fueled growing demand. Portuguese sugar dominated the global market, enriching colonists, merchants, and the crown. Lisbon, weakened in Asia, regained a central place in European trade thanks to it. But this prosperity rested on a human tragedy. The indigenous workforce, decimated by diseases and wars, prompted Portugal to turn massively to Africa. Ships departed from the coasts of Angola and the Gulf of Guinea, laden with captives torn from their lands. The long and deadly Atlantic crossing became a nightmare for millions of men, women, and children. Those who survived were sold as slaves in Brazil's plantations. There, under a relentless sun, they worked to exhaustion, fueling an unforgiving economic machine. This triangular trade, linking Europe, Africa, and America, gave Portugal new power, but also condemned it to structural dependence. The revenues from sugar were colossal but fragile. The slightest price fluctuation, competition from the Antilles, or attacks by corsairs were enough to jeopardize them. Moreover, the slave system, a source of profit, also sparked resistance, slave revolts, escapes into the interior, and the creation of maroon communities that defied colonial authority. Brazil was not only a paradise of riches, it was also a social volcano, always ready to erupt. In the 18th century, a new resource disrupted the balance: gold. In the 1690s, deposits were discovered in the Minas Gerais region, inland Brazil. The news spread like wildfire, drawing colonists, adventurers, and slaves to these mountainous lands. Soon, thousands of miners settled, relentlessly exploiting the veins. Gold flowed to Lisbon in spectacular quantities. It is estimated that during the 18th century, Brazil supplied half of the world's gold production. This flow transformed Portugal. Lisbon adorned itself with palaces, churches, and sumptuous monuments, financed by the cargoes from across the Atlantic. The crown lived in splendor that impressed Europe. The kingdom, long considered peripheral, seemed to become a great power again thanks to its Brazilian empire. But here, too, this prosperity had a downside. The Portuguese economy became dependent on Brazilian gold, neglecting local agricultural and industrial development. Quick fortunes fueled corruption, luxury, and dependence on foreign imports, particularly English ones. Slavery, already central to the sugar cycle, intensified further with the gold rush. Hundreds of thousands of Africans were deported to work in the mines and plantations. Portuguese slaving ships tirelessly crossed the Atlantic, turning Angola into the main supplier of slaves for Brazil. This brutal system, which enriched the crown and colonists, left an indelible mark on African societies, ravaged by raids, wars, and the slave trade. Brazil thus became the undisputed jewel of the Portuguese Empire, but also its Achilles heel. Its wealth attracted all kinds of covetousness. The Dutch, in the 17th century, occupied part of the coast and seriously threatened the plantations. The Portuguese, with the help of colonists and sometimes local populations, managed to repel them after years of fierce fighting. This victory, celebrated as a national renaissance, strengthened Portugal's attachment to its American colony. But it also showed that Brazil was a contested land where every wealth invited rivalries. In this context, the Portuguese Empire took on a paradoxical character. On one hand, it experienced dazzling prosperity thanks to sugar and gold. On the other, it locked itself into a dangerous economic and political dependence. Its power rested on the exploitation of a single territory, the enslavement of millions of people, and the fragile protection of its maritime routes. Every ship laden with gold or sugar crossing the Atlantic was a target for English, French, or Dutch corsairs. Every lost cargo was a wound for an empire that could not afford to weaken. This period was both epic and dramatic. Portugal, a small European kingdom, continued to shine thanks to its empire, but it constantly struggled to defend its conquests. Its destiny was played out on turbulent seas, in naval battles, in scorching plantations, in dark mines. Every victory seemed wrested at the cost of blood. Every gained wealth heralded new threats. The empire was no longer that of the triumphant conquests of the 16th century, but one of a glorious and tragic survival, hanging on the waves of the ocean and the torments of the world. Thus, the cycle of sugar, gold, and slaves, which made Portugal's greatness in the 17th and 18th centuries, also revealed the fragility of its empire. Brazil's colossal riches financed Lisbon's splendor, but they locked the kingdom into a perilous dependence. Behind the brilliance of gold and the sweetness of sugar, the shadows of decline were already visible. Portugal, like a magnificent but fragile ship, continued its journey on a stormy sea, carried by the wind of fortune, but threatened at every moment by the tempest. Part 2. Missions, Conversions, and Cultural Exchanges in the Empire. If the Portuguese Empire of the 17th and 18th centuries rested on sugar, gold, and slavery, it also manifested in another, more subtle, but equally decisive dimension, the spread of faith, culture, and human exchanges. Behind the ships laden with riches, other vessels carried missionaries, scholars, objects, and ideas. Portugal did not content itself with dominating militarily and economically. It wove a web of cultural and religious influences that left a lasting mark on the conquered territories. But this aspect, often glorified in chronicles, also revealed the contradictions and tensions of an empire that was both dominant and fragile. From the earliest expeditions, the Portuguese crown presented itself as a champion of Christendom, continuing the crusade begun in the Iberian Peninsula. The kings of Aviz and Braganza considered themselves invested with a divine mission to bring the Catholic faith to the ends of the world. In the 17th century, this dimension took on new magnitude with the action of religious orders, particularly the Jesuits. These men, often from modest Portuguese families but driven by absolute fervor, set out to evangelize Africa, Asia, and America. In Brazil, their role was central. While colonists exploited sugar plantations and gold mines, the Jesuits founded missions in the interior. They gathered indigenous populations, taught them the Christian faith, and instructed them in agriculture and Latin script. These reductions, later inspired by the Spanish experience in Paraguay, became refuges from slave raids. But they were not free of symbolic violence. They imposed a European way of life, erasing local traditions and languages. For the indigenous people, they were both protection and constraint, survival and assimilation. In Africa, missionary action followed the routes of the slave trade. Priests accompanied ships, baptized captives before their embarkation, and sought to convert the African kingdoms allied with Portugal. Some rulers of the Congo or Angola adopted Christianity, seeing it as a way to enhance their prestige and ties with Lisbon. But this conversion was often superficial, limited to an elite, while the majority of the population continued to practice ancestral beliefs. The clash between the two worlds resulted in syncretisms, cults where Christian saints mingled with African deities, where ancient rites survived under a Catholic veneer. In Asia, the situation was even more complex. In Goa, which became the capital of the Portuguese East, missionaries built immense churches that rivaled Hindu temples. The city became as much a spiritual as a commercial center, radiating across the region. In Malacca, the Portuguese imposed their faith in a Muslim and Buddhist environment, often hostile. In Macao, they obtained the right to evangelize part of the population, but under the strict supervision of Chinese authorities. There, the Jesuits shone through their diplomatic intelligence. They adopted the local language and customs, translated the Gospels into Chinese, and dialogued with Confucian scholars. Figures like Matteo Ricci, though an Italian Jesuit, illustrated this approach of cultural adaptation made possible through Portuguese networks. These missions, despite their fervor, revealed the empire's contradictions. They aimed to convert, but had to compromise with local realities. They preached love of neighbor, but coexisted with a massive slave system. They taught the Christian faith, but also became instruments of political control, legitimizing Portuguese domination. This ambiguity fueled constant tensions between colonists and missionaries. The former wanted to exploit indigenous labor, while the latter sometimes sought to protect it. Cultural exchanges were not limited to religion. The Portuguese Empire became a vast crossroads where objects, tastes, and knowledge circulated. Pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg from Asia entered European kitchens. Brazilian sugar revolutionized diets, transforming the habits of aristocratic courts. Chinese porcelain, silks, and lacquered furniture arrived in Lisbon, sparking a craze for exoticism. In return, Europe exported its weapons, textiles, and books. In the colonies, this circulation created mixed societies. In Brazil, Europeans, Africans, and Amerindians intermingled, giving rise to a new culture rich in its multiple influences. Languages, music, and beliefs fused, creating a unique universe where Portuguese fado coexisted with African rhythms and indigenous chants. In Goa, a Luso-Indian identity emerged, blending Portuguese architecture with local traditions. In Macao, a Creole society developed with its own customs and mixed marriages. These métissages were the bright side of an empire that, despite the violence of its domination, engendered unprecedented encounters and creations. But they were also sources of tension. Colonial authorities often sought to maintain a strict hierarchy between Europeans and local populations, between free and enslaved. Yet daily reality escaped this control, blurring boundaries, giving rise to hybrid communities that Lisbon could neither fully accept nor entirely reject. The 17th and 18th centuries thus saw Portugal torn between the grandeur of a universal mission and the limits of an empire confronted with its contradictions. Its faith aimed to conquer, but it had to compromise with resistance. Its culture spread, but transformed in contact with others. Its missionaries preached spiritual unity, but its ships carried chains. This paradox lent Portuguese history a dramatic intensity. In every church built amidst the tropics, the echo of prayers mingled with the rumble of sugar mills. In every mission in Brazil's interior, the tension between protecting indigenous people and their forced assimilation was palpable. In every African port, bells rang alongside the clank of slaves' chains. The Portuguese Empire, in the 17th and 18th centuries, was both a spiritual power and an economic machine, a human adventure and a tragedy. Thus, missions, conversions, and cultural exchanges were not mere ornaments to colonial history. They were its contradictory soul. They remind us that the Portuguese Empire was not only an empire of riches, but also one of ideas, beliefs, and métissage. And it is in this tension between light and darkness, between faith and exploitation, that its destiny was played out. Part 3. Revolts, Crises, and Brazil's Independence. Throughout the 18th century, Brazil became the soul of the Portuguese Empire, its greatest wealth and its heaviest burden. Sugar plantations, gold mines, herds, forests, everything contributed to making this colony an economic giant. Lisbon lived to the rhythm of transatlantic cargoes, dependent on this constant flow of resources. But this prosperity concealed growing instability. Behind the apparent power, cracks widened. Slave revolts, social tensions, military fragility, economic dependence on England. Little by little, the empire's foundations fractured, heralding the inevitable separation. Slave revolts were the first to shake Brazil. In the plantations of Pernambuco, the mines of Minas Gerais, the fields of Bahia, slaves fled, regrouped, and armed themselves. They founded communities called quilombos, true bastions of resistance. The most famous, the Quilombo of Palmares, existed for nearly a century, gathering thousands of fugitives. Entrenched in the forest, these men and women defied Portuguese troops, waging a relentless guerrilla war. Their resistance, though ultimately crushed, revealed the fragility of a colonial system based on coercion and violence. Every escape, every revolt, was a reminder that Portuguese domination rested on a precarious balance. The colonists themselves expressed discontent. Gold extraction, highly lucrative at first, gradually declined by the late 18th century. The Minas Gerais deposits waned, yet Lisbon continued to impose crushing taxes. Colonists denounced this fiscal pressure, accusing the metropolis of siphoning off wealth without offering anything in return. In 1789, the Minas Gerais conspiracy, also known as the Inconfidencia Mineira, erupted. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals in the American Revolution, it called for Brazil's independence. Though suppressed, with its symbolic leader Tiradentes executed, this revolt became a founding myth. It proved that the spirit of liberty had crossed the Atlantic. At the same time, the international situation changed. Portugal, a small European kingdom, could not compete with emerging great powers. England became its indispensable protector. Commercial treaties signed between Lisbon and London, such as the Methuen Treaty of 1703, reinforced economic dependence. In exchange for Portuguese wine, markets were flooded with English manufactured goods. This alliance, militarily salvaging, locked Portugal into an unequal relationship where its empire served British interests more than its own. The fragility reached its peak in 1807 when Napoleon's troops invaded Portugal. The court, unable to resist, made an unprecedented decision to transfer the monarchy's seat to Brazil. Lisbon was abandoned, and King John VI settled in Rio de Janeiro, transforming the colony into the empire's capital. This event, unique in colonial history, disrupted the balance. Brazil ceased to be a mere colony. It became the center of power. Local elites tasted new autonomy, institutions developed, and Rio asserted itself as a royal metropolis. When Napoleon was defeated and the court returned to Europe in 1821, the situation was irreversible. Brazil, accustomed to being treated as a kingdom, no longer wanted to revert to colonial status. Tensions rose between Lisbon, seeking to reassert its authority, and Brazilian elites, determined to preserve their privileges and autonomy. The spark came in 1822 when Dom Pedro, son of King John VI, who had remained in Brazil, proclaimed independence in Sao Paulo with his famous Grito do Ipiranga. Brazil became an independent empire, with Dom Pedro I as its sovereign. For Portugal, this loss was an earthquake. Brazil represented its largest and richest possession. Its loss meant the collapse of an essential part of its economy and prestige. Sugar, gold, vast lands, strategic ports, all now escaped Lisbon's control. The Portuguese Empire, which had once seemed to dominate the planet, saw its center detach and rise as a sovereign nation. Yet Brazil's independence was not a total defeat on the battlefield. It was achieved almost without open war, through a political and diplomatic process. This reflected both Portugal's weakness, unable to mobilize its forces, and the lucidity of its elites, aware that a prolonged conflict would only worsen their ruin. But symbolically, the wound was immense. Portugal entered the 19th century diminished, reduced to its African and Asian colonies. Once peripheral, now the last lifelines of a declining empire. This moment was dramatic, almost tragic. Portugal, pioneer of the great discoveries, master of the oceans in the 16th century, saw its American jewel torn away. It was not only a material loss, but a political humiliation, an end of an era. The Brazilian Empire, born from its own foundations, emancipated itself, leaving Lisbon drained. The Atlantic Ocean, once the stage of its grandeur, became the mirror of its fragility. Brazil's independence perfectly illustrated Portugal's paradoxical destiny. With limited means, It had built an immense empire, linking all continents. But this empire, too vast for its strength, could not last forever. The wealth it generated turned against it, fueling ambitious colonial elites eager to break free from metropolitan tutelage. The ideals of liberty, carried by the Enlightenment and Atlantic revolutions, completed the fracturing of the old imperial structure. Thus, in 1822, a world collapsed. Portugal was no longer the great power it had been, but its imperial history, already centuries old, did not end there. There were still lands to defend, colonies to exploit, struggles to wage, yet the shadow of decline now loomed over every port, every fortress, every ship flying the Portuguese flag. Brazil, the pearl torn from the crown, left behind a weakened metropolis and an amputated empire still seeking survival. Chapter 5. Decline and Legacy. Part 1. The Long Twilight, the 19th Century, and Loss of Prestige. After Brazil's independence in 1822, Portugal awoke as an amputated giant. The empire, once spanning 4 continents, was now reduced to a constellation of possessions in Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic. Lisbon, once the capital of a connected world, was now merely a small European metropolis, struggling to maintain its rank in a century dominated by new industrial powers: England, France, and soon Germany. Portugal then entered what can be called its long twilight, a period marked by decline, diplomatic humiliations, and desperate efforts to save the remnants of an oversized empire. From the early 19th century, signs of weakness were evident. The country, ravaged by the Napoleonic Wars and dependent on England for its survival, struggled to recover. The economy relied almost exclusively on colonial trade, but this had lost its main pillar with Brazil's separation. Cargoes of sugar and gold no longer filled Lisbon's docks as before. Public finances collapsed, and the crown, weakened, had to negotiate its very existence with the great European powers. The remaining colonies appeared as a last resort. Angola and Mozambique in Africa, Goa in India, Macao in China, Timor in Southeast Asia. So many territories still under the Portuguese flag, but threatened from all sides. The Industrial Revolution, transforming Europe in the 19th century, heightened the colonial appetites of the great powers. The English, already firmly established in India and southern Africa, eyed Angola and Mozambique. The French, after consolidating their empire in North Africa and Indochina, advanced into West and East Africa. Portugal, poor and ill-prepared, found itself cornered, forced to defend its legacy against infinitely more powerful adversaries. To try to save its possessions, Lisbon multiplied declarations of sovereignty. Expeditions were sent into the African interior to draw maps, plant flags, and sign treaties with local chiefs. But these gestures, more symbolic than real, were insufficient. At the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, where European powers officially divided Africa, Portugal faced humiliation. Its claims to vast interior territories between Angola and Mozambique were contested by England. The famous pink map, Mapa Cor-de-Rosa, representing Portuguese ambitions to unite its African colonies from west to east, was swept aside by the British ultimatum of 1890. Unable to resist, Portugal back down, definitively losing any pretension to becoming a great colonial power again. This ultimatum, experienced as a betrayal by the Portuguese people, caused a shockwave. Lisbon streets filled with protests, elites denounced the government's weakness, and the monarchy emerged significantly weakened. The pride of a nation that had once dominated the seas was shattered by the harsh reality. In the 19th century, Portugal was no longer a major player, merely tolerated but watched by Europe's giants. The empire still existed, but it was only a shadow of its past splendor. Yet, despite this decline, the Portuguese Empire retained a certain dramatic intensity. Angola and Mozambique became fields of colonial experimentation, where administrators, missionaries, and settlers clashed. The Portuguese, unable to compete technologically with the British or French, relied on a more diffuse presence made up of military posts, commercial concessions, and religious missions. Maritime routes were still controlled by Portuguese ships, but these seemed insignificant compared to the modern battleships of the Royal Navy. In the colonies, the situation was mixed. In Goa and Macao, the Portuguese presence was reduced to tiny enclaves, tolerated by surrounding empires. In Africa, Portuguese settlers were a small minority, facing numerous and resistant local populations. The empire survived more through historical inertia than real power. Yet every fort, every trading post, every flag still flew as a heroic vestige, a reminder that this small European kingdom had once dared to defy the ocean and conquer the planet. The 19th century was also marked by internal upheavals. Portugal experienced revolutions, regime changes, and economic crises that prevented it from fully focusing on its empire. The monarchy wavered. Threatened by republicans, Portuguese society, impoverished, sometimes regarded its colonies with indifference, even weariness, as they seemed to cost more than they yielded. Yet the imperial idea continued to haunt minds like a national nostalgia, a founding myth that refused to be abandoned. This long twilight was imbued with a tragic atmosphere. The Portuguese Empire was not yet dead, but it was condemned to fight for its survival. Every concession to the great powers was a wound, every lost territory an amputation. Lisbon lived in the memory of its grandeur, recalling Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Goa, and Brazil, while facing its weakness against modern empires. History became an immense shadow cast over a fragile present, and yet, in this decline, there remained a form of epic, that of a kingdom that, despite its smallness, clung to its imperial dream, that of a people refusing to yield entirely even when its ambitions were shattered, that of an empire that, though reduced to tatters, continued to defy time and the giants of its era. Portugal, in the 19th century, was no longer the master of the seas, but it remained a survivor, and in its survival echoed the grandeur of its past. Part 2. Colonial Wars in Africa and the End of the Empire. In the 20th century, the Portuguese Empire seemed already anachronistic. While most European colonial powers began a process of decolonization after World War II, Lisbon clung fiercely to its African and Asian possessions. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, Goa, Macao, and East Timor. So many territories still under the Portuguese flag, vestiges of a centuries-old empire. But this obstinacy, rooted in a mix of nostalgia, pride, and political will, would precipitate Portugal into one of the most tragic and bloody periods of its contemporary history. From the 1950s, the world changed rapidly. Independent India, led by Nehru, claimed its former colonial territories. In 1961, the Indian Army invaded Goa, ending over 4 centuries of Portuguese presence. The episode, brutal and humiliating, revealed the fragility of an empire unable to resist the great powers of the modern world. But Lisbon, led by Salazar's authoritarian regime, refused to see Goa as a warning sign. For the dictator, yielding the colonies would mean renouncing the very essence of the Portuguese nation, inseparable from its imperial history. Africa then became the last bastion of this ideology. Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau were presented by the regime not as colonies, but as overseas provinces, integral parts of the national territory. This political fiction barely masked the reality. They were colonies subjected to authoritarian central administration, exploited for their resources, and dominated by a minority of European settlers. But from the 1960s, the wind of decolonization swept across Africa, and independence movements took up arms. In 1961, war broke out in Angola. Nationalist guerrillas attacked plantations, military posts, and convoys. The Portuguese army, ill-prepared, had to send tens of thousands of soldiers to restore order. Soon, the guerrilla warfare spread to Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. The fighting became a total war, a war of attrition, where the Portuguese, though equipped and disciplined, became bogged down against elusive adversaries. These colonial wars profoundly transformed Portugal. Every year, thousands of young men were sent to Africa, forced to spend several years in military service. Many did not return. Those who survived brought back tales of violence, exhaustion, and absurdity. Families in Europe lived in anguish and resentment. The empire, meant to be a source of pride, became a bloody burden, tearing Portuguese society apart. On the ground, the war took on epic and tragic dimensions. In the dense forests of Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese soldiers faced guerrillas, supported by Cuba and the Soviet Union. In Angola, the plains and savannas became the stage for constant ambushes. In Mozambique, mountains and villages turned into battlefields. Helicopters, armored columns, and entrenched camps evoked modern wars more than the glorious expeditions of past centuries. Every Portuguese victory was temporary. Every defeat widened the abyss. In Lisbon, the regimes of Salazar and later Caetano refused to yield. To justify the effort, they invoked history, the civilizing mission, and national honor. But in Europe, Portugal appeared increasingly isolated, the last obstinate colonial empire in a world turning toward independence. Traditional allies, even England, urged Lisbon to let go. The UN condemned the repression, and independence movements gained growing international support. Portugal, a small and poor country, tried to resist the tide of time, but its stubbornness condemned it. The 1970s marked the breaking point. The Portuguese economy, bled dry, could no longer sustain the cost of the wars. Over 40% of the state budget was consumed by the military effort. Young generations, sacrificed on the front, rebelled against a regime sending them to die for an already doomed empire. The army itself, weary of endless fighting, became a hotbed of dissent. In the barracks, whispers grew that only a revolution could end this spiral. On April 25, 1974, this whisper became a cry. In Lisbon, young officers overthrew the regime in what would go down in history as the Carnation Revolution. Without bloodshed, soldiers, supported by the population, ended decades of dictatorship. The message was clear. Portugal had to turn the page on its empire. In the following months, decolonization accelerated at a dizzying pace. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe proclaimed their independence between 1974 and 1975. East Timor, abandoned in chaos, was invaded by Indonesia. Macau remained under Portuguese administration, but its eventual transfer to China was already inevitable in the long term. In a few months, the Portuguese Empire, over 5 centuries old, collapsed like a house of cards. This moment, both liberating and dramatic, marked the end of an era. Portugal, reduced to its European borders, had to reinvent itself. For many, it was a wound. The imperial dream that had shaped national identity vanished abruptly. For others, it was a deliverance. The country could finally turn toward the future, join democratic Europe, and end an absurd war. But in the collective memory, the image remains that of an empire that fought to the end, refusing to yield before collapsing all at once. Thus ended the Portuguese colonial epic. Not in the glory of discoveries, nor in the splendor of spice and gold cargoes, but in the flames of African guerrillas and the scent of the carnations of revolution. This denouement, both tragic and poetic, symbolized the paradoxical destiny of an empire to have been the first to unite the world by sea and the last to renounce its colonies. Part 3. The Portuguese Legacy: Languages, Cultures, Diaspora, and Memory. When the Portuguese Empire collapsed in the mid-1970s, it left behind a political and economic void, but also a deep and lasting imprint. 5 centuries of expansion, conquests, trade, violence, and exchanges shaped a legacy that continues to live today, long after the Portuguese flag disappeared from the colonies. This legacy is multifaceted, sometimes glorious, sometimes painful. It is read in languages, cultures, diasporas, but also in memories, torn between pride and wounds. The most visible legacy is undoubtedly the language. Portuguese, born in a small corner of the Iberian Peninsula, became one of the world's great languages. With over 250 million speakers, it is spoken in Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, and of course, Portugal. In Macau, it remains an official language alongside Chinese. In each country, it has taken on a unique flavor, enriched by African, Amerindian, and Asian words, giving rise to multiple variants. This linguistic miracle testifies to the power of Portuguese expansion. A language born of a modest people became a link between several continents. But the legacy is not limited to language. Portuguese culture, in its diversity, spread and transformed through contact with others. In Brazil, music, cuisine, and literature blend European, African, and indigenous influences. Samba, born of African rhythms, unfolds in Portuguese, becoming a national symbol. Brazilian literature, from Machado de Assis to Jorge Amado, expresses itself in a language inherited from Portugal but adapted to a new reality. In Angola and Mozambique, poetry and novels by writers like Agostinho Neto or Mia Couto give Portuguese an African flavor rooted in local landscapes and traditions. This cultural legacy is also architectural and religious. In the former colonies, one finds Baroque churches with white and blue facades, fortresses facing the sea, villages organized around a central square. Catholicism, brought by missionaries, remains the majority religion in most Lusophone countries today. But this Catholicism has become hybridized. In Africa, it has mingled with traditional beliefs. In Brazil, it has been enriched by Afro-Brazilian practices like candomblé. In Asia, it has adopted certain local customs. Each territory has transformed the Portuguese legacy, creating a patchwork of traditions and spiritualities. The diaspora is another essential element. Over the centuries, millions of Portuguese emigrated to Brazil, Africa, and Europe. Today, significant Portuguese communities are found in France, Switzerland, Luxembourg, the United States, and Canada. These diasporas maintain ties between Portugal and the rest of the world, spreading its culture, cuisine, and songs. Fado, the music of saudade, has become a universal symbol, sung in Lisbon, but also in the Portuguese quarters of Rio, Paris, or Newark. But this legacy is not only made of cultural riches, it is also marked by the pain and memory of colonial violence. Slavery, which deported millions of Africans to Brazil and the Antilles, remains a deep scar. In the former colonies, the memory of domination, colonial wars, and humiliations remains vivid. In Portugal itself, this history is sometimes a source of unease. Between imperial nostalgia and guilt, the country still struggles to reconcile with its past. The memory of the empire is a field of tensions between those who see it as a glorious adventure and those who recall the suffering it inflicted. The economic legacy is more ambiguous. Portugal long profited from its empire's riches, but this dependence also prevented it from developing a modern industrial economy. After the empire's fall, the country had to rebuild almost from scratch, joining the circle of developed European nations late. The former colonies, entering independence often weakened, were marked by poverty, civil wars, and rivalries inherited from colonization. The Portuguese legacy in this regard is thus double-edged, a strong cultural bond, but also deep economic and social fractures. Yet, despite these shadows, the Portuguese Empire left a lasting mark on world history. It was the first global empire linking Europe, Africa, Asia, and America in an unprecedented network. It paved the way for globalization, connecting continents previously separated by sea. It transformed the Atlantic and Indian Oceans into highways of commerce, spaces for the circulation of people, goods, and ideas. Today, this memory endures through the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP, created in 1996, which brings together 9 states and nearly 300 million people. This space, founded on language and a shared history, illustrates how the colonial legacy has transformed into a bond of cooperation. Though marked by inequalities, It testifies to the vitality of this Lusophony, heir to a vanished empire, but still alive in words, songs, and traditions. The history of the Portuguese Empire is thus that of a human epic, contradictory and moving. Starting from a small kingdom at the edge of Europe, it shaped the entire planet. It brought discoveries, exchanges, and métissages, but also suffering, exploitation, and ruptures. It is both a story of glory and tragedy, of audacity and fragility. When one contemplates today the cobbled streets of Lisbon, the churches of Goa, the beaches of Bahia, the fortresses of Angola, or the alleys of Macao, one still feels the echo of this past. Every stone, every word, every song carries the trace of an empire that dared to embrace the world and, despite its fall, continues to inhabit memories. Portugal is no longer an empire, but its legacy lives on in the peoples who speak its language, in the cultures that have mingled, in the nostalgia of saudade, and in the strength of a universal history. Thus ends the story of the Portuguese Empire, an adventure begun in the modest ports of the Atlantic, carried by faith and audacity, which knew the grandeur of spices and gold, the dramas of slavery and wars, and which, after its collapse, leaves the world an immense and contrasted legacy, a vanished empire, but a living memory. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care, and see you soon.